Hello, welcome to How to Get a 36 on the ACT from a Perfect Score. My name is Abhinav Tiruvidala, and I'm going to show you guys how I got a 36 on the ACT and give you some various tips and test taking strategies, so hopefully you can do the same. So first let's go over a little about me. So I just completed my junior year, and I primarily throughout high school I've been taking a lot of AP classes, so I would definitely feel like the material and the rigor in those classes definitely helped me prepare for the ACT because the math section was all of the stuff that I already learned in school, so I didn't really have to learn any for the math sections. And being in tough courses like AP language and other like pre-AP level English classes helped me with the other sections as well. So how I studied was I self-studied. I didn't go to any test prep center or I didn't go and get a tutor or anything for the ACT because they were really expensive and I didn't want to spend like hundreds or even thousands of dollars on something when I knew I could just self-study and get somewhat of the same results. So how I self-studied was I would take a lot of ACT practice tests, like official ACT practice tests, rather than like Princeton Review or anything. I didn't buy a single ACT test book or anything like that. I just found the released ACT tests on the internet and used those to study. So I tested in February of 2022 for the first time, and I received my score in March of 2022. So I got an overall score of a 36. So I got a 36 on the math section, a 36 on the science section, a 36 on the reading section, and a 35 on the English section. So specifically, I missed 4 questions on the English section, missed 0 questions on the math, science, and reading section. So all my mistakes were in the English section, and I did good in the other sections. So that's like one thing I wanted to emphasize to you guys. You guys don't need a 36 on every single section to get a 36 on the exam. You can get two 36s and two 35s, and it'll average out to a 36 composite score. Or you can even get three 36s and a 34, and it'll still average into a 36. So as long as you get at least 2 or 3 36s, and even if you do like make a couple of silly mistakes on the other sections, you should still be fine getting a 36 or a 35 if that's what you're trying to go for. So first I'm going to go over some general study tips before heading into each individual section study tips. So I would say the most important thing you can do to study for the ACT is to use old ACT tests. Instead of using like the Princeton Review test or any tests like that, I really suggest you guys to use old ACT tests. You can find online like a Dropbox folder or a Google Drive of a lot of old ACT tests from when they've released them in the past. So these are the most important things you can use to study because a lot of the format and the material is going to be the same questions. So when I took my ACT test, it was like a lot more relaxing and a lot more like familiar because I took these old ACT tests. And a lot of the material that I didn't know, I learned from looking at old ACT tests, and some of that material was on the test that I actually took to get my 36. So you can definitely use these old ACT tests to see where you don't know the material that the ACT might test. So first, if you haven't started studying it, I would first take a diagnostic test. So use the exact amount of time it asks you and try to take a full test in a testing environment to see where you are, to see which sections you need the most improvement on. And so I would say initially do these sections individually and check your answers. So if you were really bad at, say, the English section, you should do that section, like you should do a lot of that practice and try to see how much you're improving in that section. And then after you do a lot of like the ones you're like not that great at, you still do a couple of the sections you're still good at. Like I personally am really good at the math section, and I still took a couple of those sections just to make sure like I'm doing it right and I'm not making like silly mistakes somewhere, and just to see if there's like any old topics that I kind of forgot after learning it in school. And then closer to the test date, probably I would say 1 to 2 weeks before you actually take the test, start trying to do a complete test. So sit down, take a test you've never taken before, use the full amount of time, like use a Scantron, use your calculator, use all of that stuff like how you would on a real test to try to see how close you are to getting that 36. And after you take it, go back over the questions you missed to try to see like if you just don't know the material or if you made a silly mistake somewhere, just so you can see if you're still on track for the 36 or if there's some things you need to brush up on before you take the test. And I would say to try to maximize the scores on the section you're good at, to try to get 36s on those sections. So if you're better at the math section, the science section, for example, if you're a STEM person, you should try to make sure you don't make any silly mistakes on these sections, because then even if you're not great at the other two sections, you can still get a 36 or a 35 if you do good enough on this section, because the ACT composite score is an average. So now that we went over some basic study tips in general, now we can go over each section specifically. So first, let's go over English. So English section is the first section you're going to see on the test, and you have 45 minutes for 75 questions. So you have less than a minute per question. So I would say the biggest thing is just making sure you go quick on this section. So usually it's just half the questions might be really easy, and the other half you might have to think a little bit more. So you have to make sure on the really easy questions you try to spend like 15 or 30 seconds on, so that way you have more time on the hard sections. And on the ACT, there's definitely going to be some questions where it's between two answer choices. So when you're here, you usually are going to have to sound out the answer choices. That helps me a lot, and try to see which one just feels more natural and which one sounds more natural. So, and that's most likely going to be the right answer, because the ACT is like a lot more, like, I would say, relaxed than the SAT. You don't really need to know as many rules, as more you have to more focus on like getting the answer like kind of right, which one just sounds more right. And the ACT loves to have like replacement type questions where you have to find like which sentence would replace a phrase, and you're usually going to have this scenario: most concise is usually right. So that's usually the case because the ACT likes to like have answer choices that already repeat information that was in an earlier part of the passage or even an earlier part of the sentence. So most of the time you're going to want to follow this rule: most concise is usually right. And on the scale specifically for the English section, the scale varies, but missing 2 is usually still a 36. And I've even seen some tests where you can get -3 and still get a 36 on this section. So a couple of errors on the English section is fine. So the next section on the test is going to be the math section. So on the math section, you have 60 minutes for 60 questions, with the questions getting progressively harder. So the math section for me was my best section because I've been doing competition math since like 6th grade, and I was in like AP Calculus, so all the material I already knew, so it was more a matter of me like making sure not to do like dumb mistakes. And the math section that's covered on the ACT is going to be a little bit harder than the SAT. So SAT is usually up to Algebra 2 with a little bit of pre-calculus, but on the ACT there are like more in-depth pre-calculus questions that still aren't that hard. But even if you're only in like geometry or Algebra 2, a 36 on the math section on the ACT is still really attainable, because the pre-calculus questions that the ACT tests are still like pretty easy to study and understand. So you don't need to like learn the entire pre-calculus, you just need to learn which topics that are covered in pre-calculus which are on the ACT, which isn't that hard. And the ACT, you can use your calculator throughout the entire test. So I always use my calculator regardless of how easy the question is. So even if it's a simple question where it's like 3x plus 7 equals 21, don't try to do it by hand. I never do it by hand. I just use my calculator to solve that out, because you just don't want to do something wrong and make a silly mistake somewhere, because the ACT test makers are really smart and they'll have an answer choice depending on like if you like for added instead of subtracted or something like that. So they're going to try to catch you when you make a mistake. So you always want to use your calculator. And the math section's timing is really important because it's pretty quick, a minute per question, but some questions are really hard while others might take like 5 or 10 seconds even. So this is the timing pace that a lot of people follow. So the first 30 questions you should try to get done in the first 20 minutes. The next 20 questions should be done in the next 20 minutes. And the last 10 questions should be done in the last 10 minutes. So I like this rule specifically because the last 10 questions are usually the questions which are like hard and require you to like think a lot, and you might like get tired in them. So that way you have like more time per question, so you can solve it out, or if you just need a tiny break, you can take a little break there. And on the scale for the math section, usually -1 is still a 36, but there's a couple of tests where I've seen like a -2 is a 36 too. So math section, you have a little bit of room for error as well. The third section in the ACT test is the reading section. So even if you're not good at the reading section on the SAT, that was kind of like where I was too, the ACT reading section is a lot easier in my opinion because all the answers are usually in the passages. So you don't really need to like try to do a lot of comprehension or do a lot of inference. All the answers are usually just going to be in the passage, and it's just a matter of reading the passage and kind of understanding and remembering. So because of this is the strategy that I use. I first skim the passage for like a minute, just try to get a basic understanding of what it is and what it's about. Then I read the questions to try to see what I need to know, and then I full read the passage to try to see like if there's anything that I like kind of remember and what makes sense to me. So this is a lot quicker pace than the SAT reading. The SAT reading is 65 minutes for 52 questions, so it's more than a minute per question, while this one is a little less than a minute per question. So you have to make sure you go quicker on this reading section, but it should be fine because most of the information that you need to know is already in the passage, so you should be fine there. And there's only a couple of questions that involve you really needing to infer that much. It's more of just reading the passage and trying to remember the information and finding the information that it asks for in the question. And on the reading section, you usually do need a 40 out of 40 for a 36. There's a couple of tests where you can get like a 39 out of 40 and get a 36, but on the majority of tests, you need to try to get every single question right to get a full score of a 36 on this section. And the final section on the ACT test is the science section. So on the science section, you have 35 minutes for 40 questions, so it's the exact same timing as the reading section. And even if you're not good at science and you have like a bad memory and you're not good at science in school, it's fine, because I like to say the science section is more about reading science passages than actual science. So it's usually just going to be a description of an experiment, and it's going to have some graphs and tables maybe. There's very little actual science that you need to know. So because of this, you never read the experiment and the graphs once you get to a new experiment, because you have 40 questions in 35 minutes, but there's usually maybe like 6 or 7 different experiments in here. So you can't read and understand every single experiment in that amount of time. So you just want to jump straight into the questions. So each question would specifically reference a graph or a table or the apparatus or the directions or one specific piece of the experiment. So you have to make sure you can go and find what it's referring to and try to see. So usually if the question is about a graph, it'll tell you like read graph 1 or refer to graph 1. Or if it's about a table, it'll say the same thing, look at graph 2 or look at table 2, and you should be fine there. And you always need to read the graph's axes for the information, see what variable is on the x-axis and see what variable is on the y-axis, and try to see the relationship between the two. Just try to see if like x increases, what happens to y, if y decreases, what happens to y. And there's usually a question or two about each graph, like something like that. So the science section, I would say, is more just the reading section, just more about science stuff and including how to read graphs. And the science section, most of the time you need a perfect 40 out of 40 to get a 36, but again, there have been maybe I would say 20 or 25% of tests, you can get like a 39 out of 40 and still get a 36. And finally, let's go over some tips what you should do during the test itself. So the first thing, and what I think is the most important thing, is not to panic. Even if you felt like that English section was the worst section you have ever taken in your life and you feel like you got like a 10 on it, it's 100% fine, because this is for 2 reasons. First, you might think you did really bad on it, but at the end of the day, you might have got a good score. Like I felt like I did really bad on my English section, but I still was able to get a 35 because it was a harder English section, so the curve was better. So just remember that if you felt like it was hard, the chances are a lot of other people might feel like it was hard too, and the curve might be easier. So don't panic. And second, even if you do end up doing really bad on it, it's fine, because if you wanted to like super score your ACT, you gotta still make sure you can do good on the math, science, and reading section, so that way you can have a good super score later on if you take the ACT again. And you also need to remember that you don't need a 36 on all the sections to get a 36 on the ACT. The ACT composite score is an average, so you can get 2 36s and 2 35s, or you can get 3 36s and 1 34, and you can still get a 36 that way. So you have to remember that you just need to try your best on every single section, and regardless of how well you feel like you did on the previous ones. And the next tip I would give you is to fill out all the bubbles as you go. So you don't want to try to fill in all the bubbles in the last 2 minutes or something like that, in case you like lose track of time. You don't want to leave all your work on the page and get a 5 or a 6 on the ACT because on that section because you didn't fill in the bubbles. So every single time you finish a question, if you know that you got the answer right, bubble it in. But if you feel like you might have to come back and check, it's fine. You don't need to bubble it in. But I would say bubble in most of your answers as you go, just so you have more time at the end to work on the last couple of questions that you're not sure about instead of having to bubble everything in. Then I would say don't spend too much time on one question. On the English section and on the math section, as I showed, you can miss 1 or even 2 and still get a 36. So if there's one question that's really bugging you and you can't figure it out at all, don't spend 10 or 15 minutes on that one question. Just skip it, forget about it, and just guess something at the end of the day. You don't want to have to get a bad score on that section because you spent more time looking at that one question that you might not know how to solve at all, instead of looking at the questions that you do know how to solve. And finally, that last 5th section doesn't count. So the ACT has an experimental section like the SAT, where after you finish the science section, they'll give you a random section to use as the 5th section, and it doesn't count at all. So I was a little bit stressed when I got this 5th section because I was really tired after taking the ACT, and I felt like I was going to do bad if I did bad on this one section because it was science, because I got a random science passage. But then I learned that the 5th section doesn't count, so I was a lot more relaxed. So obviously you shouldn't try to just answer A for all of these sections for the last section, but just remember the 5th section doesn't count, so you can relax a little bit more and know that you're finished with the ACT. And that's going to be it for this video on how to get a 36 from a perfect score. I'm sure you guys are going to have some questions and comments on how to get a 36, so feel free to leave them down below in the comments and I'll address them when I have time. So thank you for watching, and if you liked the video, please like and subscribe. I'll see you guys next time.